Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to learn about our work with advancing the FAIR and CARE principles in archaeology to support ethical data management. So archaeology, as many of you know, has really generated massive amounts of data over the past 40 to 50 years. And now we're seeing an increase in the volume, the variety, and velocity at which data and information are being produced. Everything from drone-based LiDARs, portable XRFs, ground-penetrating radar, and different methods for acquiring spatial data. And I even grabbed some of the data collection images from Crow Canyon, who is really doing a fantastic job with that. But considering the vast amount of data that's being produced, archaeologists in general really need to consider data management and preservation strategies. So archaeologists have been producing massive amounts of information, across the cultural heritage sector in the United States. And we can sort of take some snapshots of what's been going on in terms of the amount of information being produced. If we look at the time period from 1985 to about 2012, there was over 851,000 archaeological field studies. There was over 140 million acres surveyed in 33,000 data recovery projects. Now, if we fast forward to today, we're looking at over $1 billion a year being spent on compliance archaeology, with 1 million sites being recorded, 100,000 excavation, and 1 billion artifacts being curated. But the question becomes is, where is all of this information associated with all of this work? So we're dealing with a lot of information loss. A lot of it's locked in hard drives or notebooks or in gray literature. And I'm guessing that a lot of people on this call have used things like the 3.5-inch floppy or even other antiquated or obsolete digital mediums. And that really does make information harder to find, access, interoperate, and reuse. And this data loss is ongoing and it's expensive. We have a case, it's almost like that scene at the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where our information is being tucked in the far recesses of some warehouse. And we really need to think about how we can solve this crisis. And really, we are looking at a digital curation crisis. And this really isn't restricted to archaeology, it's across the sciences. And there are reports of all sorts of lost data. And we know that gray literature is often hard to find and that there's data obsolescence. And like I said, there's a lot of information that's hidden on personal computers, closed servers that are unsearchable or even unreadable. And so we also have concerns over things like hardware failure, software obsolescence, and poor metadata that make that long-term preservation of information difficult and ultimately leading to data loss. And this has been written about extensively in the literature. So what can we start to do, or how can we approach some different strategies? Well, one of the things we know is that there are data repositories out there. But if we look at archaeology specifically, we can go over and look at the Registry of Research Data Repositories and do a search by discipline to see what types of repositories there are out there for different disciplines beyond anthropology and archaeology. And they list about 70 repositories for ancient cultures, where if you look at things like the life sciences and the natural sciences, they have well over 1,500 to 1,300 repositories respectively, which absolutely dwarfs archaeology. So we know that we're looking at limited engagement with data preservation, limited infrastructure, including cyber infrastructure. There's a lack of guidance and limited understanding of data sovereignty and data governance, especially with indigenous peoples and descendant communities. So what are the things that we can do moving forward?
So a useful approach to addressing these challenges is through consideration and implementation of the FAIR guiding principles for scientific data management and stewardship, which were first published in 2016 and which work to eliminate barriers to the reuse of data wherever they're stored by humans and machines. This applies to data sets such as spreadsheets, images, maps, 3D models, and the like, and also to metadata, that is information that provides context for the data itself, such as the author, date created, file type, etc. The acronym FAIR means data are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You can find more details about what each of these means and how to apply each term by going to the link on the screen or just by Googling the term. So Although the FAIR principles have received a lot of attention in many disciplines, they're not as well known in the world of archaeology and cultural heritage. Next slide, please. But since archaeological histories are unique and irreplaceable, paying more attention to good data management would really benefit the discipline. FAIR helps us avoid certain traps. For example, data kept only in commercial and proprietary formats and infrastructure may be vulnerable to vendor lock-in, co-option, or inaccessibility. Data that are more intelligible and reusable, especially in non-proprietary media and services, are more likely to survive and have impact and value in the future. So FAIR can have an important role in the preservation and conservation of knowledge about the past. Some aspects of FAIR principles are easier to apply than others, but 100% compliance with FAIR is not the goal. Rather, working towards FAIR data is what's important. Being mindful of how the choices you make now will impact the future use or perhaps loss of your data. We also want to emphasize, and we'll come back to this again in a moment, that protected or sensitive data can also be fair. The FAIR principles do not necessarily mean data must be open access or free. Data should be accessible, understandable, and usable to those who need it, even if access controls and permissions need to be in place to protect sensitive information. So for example, sensitive medical data needs to be protected, but it also needs to be available and usable to authorized healthcare providers. So FAIR provides important guidance to make both open data and protected data more useful and beneficial. On to Neha.
Oh, I think Desiree's next. You're muted.
You're muted.
When the FAIR and CARE principles were put together, a lot of it really emphasized data accessibility by scholars being available for further research and really overlooked the people from whom the data was came from and what ended up happening with that data. And there has been a long trajectory, particularly in the study of anthropology, archaeology, and other sciences, social sciences that looked at Indigenous people, where Indigenous people questioned the relevance of some of the research that was being conducted on their communities and of their people. And so as FAIR started to be, the FAIR principles started to be discussed, a lot of Indigenous scholars and allies started to question, well, what about the data that is derived from these communities? Who has access? Where is this data going? And how, in some instances, this data is being used against Indigenous people. Data governance, the way that it was currently practiced at the time, really ignored Indigenous sovereignty. Sovereignty being the rights of a group of people being able to determine how they're being treated, how to deal with their lands, their resources, and their cultural heritage. And allowing Indigenous people to have sovereignty, not allowing, but to acknowledge that Indigenous people have sovereignty is recognized by the United States Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so when you start to, as a scholar, understand that Indigenous data sovereignty is more than just site locations, but it's actually data that's derived from a group of people, Indigenous people, their persons, as well as anything that's related to that community, which could include stories as well as landscapes and those other relatives, which some Indigenous communities see plants and animals as being part of their worldview. And so we must make sure that when we're talking about data and how we handle it through the whole research process, that we're recognizing that Indigenous people should be able to govern their data, make sure that they are not able to access it and then use it for themselves. A lot of times this data has been used to remove them, dispossess them, and silence their voices from policies and procedures that may affect them. So how do we address these types of shortcomings? Next slide. In 2018, the International a group of researchers that were participating in the International Data Week and Research Data Alliance plenary hosted, participated in an event in which they drafted what are called the CARE principles. CARE principles were created in 2018 in order to make sure that the indigenous communities have the authority over the data that is derived from their people and their relatives and their cultural knowledge. That it's important to make sure that data is advancing indigenous innovation and self-determination and acknowledging that they have the right to be able to protect this data that's within their language, their traditional knowledge and practices are protected. Next slide. So what do the CARE principles stand for? C stands for collective benefit, where you have data that's designed and functions in the way which the indigenous people can use them for their own benefit, that they can use that data in order, for instance, to create a better water distribution system for any type of gardens that they have for their medicine, for instance. Another principle within the CARE principles is authority to control, that indigenous people's rights are protected and that they must be have the authority to decide where the data is going, who has use of it, and most importantly, how it's interpreted. Responsibility is the next principle, and anybody that is working with indigenous data has a responsibility to make sure that all of the principles within CARE are being followed, and that the data as it's being used by whatever project you have to be working with, ensures indigenous people's self-determination and making sure that data is being collected that will eventually be used for their collective benefit. With that responsibility comes accountability, and we need to make sure that we hold ourselves accountable to follow those principles. Then, of course, there's the ethics, the bottom line, ensuring that indigenous rights and well-being should be of utmost concern in all stages of the data life cycle, and making sure that what we do does not adversely affect those indigenous communities. Neha?
Great. Thank you, Desiree. So as Sarah explained, the FAIR principles are a globally recognized set of guidelines for research data management. They're data-centric in that they inform the description and the structure of data through metadata. And I'm going to come back and talk about that in a few minutes. The second point on FAIR principles is that they're often considered synonymous with open science. But FAIR is not interchangeable with open science. So you can have open data that are not necessarily findable, accessible, interoperable, or reusable. So think about the PDFs. And it's absolutely possible to have data that are FAIR, but are not fully open, as Sarah explained, for medical information. Now, open science actually refers to an umbrella. This is a movement to democratize all aspects of scientific process, including the conceptualization and design, data gathering, publication and peer review, and dissemination of those research findings. So it really seems to offer a pretty laudable goal that we can rally behind. But this ideology also obscures colonial practices in science. It diminishes the rights of communities, of indigenous peoples and descendant communities when it comes to information that originate from their bodies, from their lands, their waters, their communities. And this is problematic. Next slide, please. Now, in American archaeology, open science is framed as a solution to three issues: data ownership, secrecy in the archaeological process, and the exclusion of non-specialists, the broad public, from the practice of archaeology. And the focus has tended to be on data collection, the techniques that we use to analyze data, and the forms in which archaeological knowledge are circulated. Now, this view of archaeology is based on the idea of universal heritage. So everyone owns it. Everyone cares for it. But in practice, we know that everyone does not get to make decisions. Everyone is not included in caretaking. And typically, it is the archaeologists who claim authority on a community and a group's heritage. So how does a tribe exercise its cultural rights when ancestors are locked in a Western institution away from their community? Or when a community is disconnected from those tangible heritage that represent them? So open science doesn't actually go into the issues of interpretation of archaeological data. What is the research actually telling us? What does it mean? And this is a key thing that communities are interested in. And rather, open science tends to default to the dominant view on heritage as something that's left behind, rather than something that we carry with us today and through which you can tell our stories and the cultural practices that we are connected to both today and into the future. And in this way, open science doesn't actually destabilize power. In many ways, it's actually reinforcing the hold of dominant groups over technologies, over narratives, and decision-making. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for FAIR and metadata? So metadata is a concept that is well established in library and information sciences. This is a tool that provides a layer of information about the underlying data set. And it helps us retrieve data sets, evaluate their relevance, assess their quality and suitability for our specific purposes. Now, scholars in museums, in libraries, and archives use metadata to document, to categorize, to classify collections and information. They know really well that these terms that we use in subject headings are not neutral. They reflect subjectivities that often marginalize tribal knowledge. So, for example, this could be a lack of authoritative names of tribes and peoples, or place names, or perhaps the use of historical periodization in cataloging and classification schemes, and inaccurate terms to even describe the diversity of indigenous topics. Now, you can picture a community member or an elder typing in the name of their tribe to retrieve information about their community, and then basically getting lots of information that has nothing to do with their people. So metadata can invisibilize tribes, descendant communities in databases and in digital archives and repositories. But we can also create cultural metadata that accurately reflect the unseen people, their knowledge, their expectations. This is central in traditional knowledge and biocultural labels that can be used as digital tags to accompany data sets in the data lifecycle. Next slide, please. So now, as Desiree explained, the CARE principles are a framework that are grounded in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this framework creates a space to center people and purpose in research. And CARE situates community in the center of all aspects of research, to have decision-making rights from the very design of that research, so that the community's questions and expectations are built into the project, through to creating data, the interpretation and results, to reporting, and all the way through to sharing and translating this to policy. Now, crucially, CARE keeps community involved as active decision makers throughout this data lifecycle. So we never actually break the community's connection with data in the first place. And so when we bring FAIR and CARE together, this is about recognizing the cycle of disconnection, the misuse and harm that's already in the data system, and then replacing it with active decision-making, prioritizing benefits from that research for the community, and also nurturing capacity in the communities that we work with. So when we see archaeology through the lens of FAIR and CARE, data have a life after reporting and publication. They have a life after curation and preservation. That isn't the end of the cycle. The question is, how do we make all of this go? I'm going to pass it back to Sarah.
So consideration of these challenges and opportunities had led to the establishment of the Advancing Fair and Care Practices in Cultural Heritage Project, which was launched with funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the IMLS, in 2023, and for which the four of us are co-directors. And again, we want to take a moment actually to stress how grateful we are to the IMLS for supporting this work, and also to all the participants on this project for sharing their time and expertise. And I see a few of them in the webinar audience now. The project is working to develop and promote ethical good practice guidance and data governance models in cultural heritage management and archaeology by integrating digital data governance, that is FAIR, and indigenous data governance, that is CARE, into everyday work practices at institutional and individual levels and in policymaking. The project's 45 participants, which form the FAIR and CARE Cultural Heritage Network, meet regularly online and in person, and the majority of grant funds from the IMLS go towards establishing a strong network, to supporting their participants for their time as well as travel to network workshops. Next slide, please. Network participants represent digital archives, academics, CRM firms, state historic preservation offices, tribal historic preservation officers, professional societies, museums, publishers, governmental agencies, libraries, and data repositories. This is the first time these diverse constituencies are collaboratively researching ways to advance fair and care practices in this sector, and we hope that by cultivating these relationships, this project will encourage sustained partnerships beyond the 3-year grant period. The vision for this undertaking is to develop tools and processes to address both the technical and ethical aspects of curating digital data important to these communities. Sustained relationship building is at the heart of our efforts, but in terms of specific grant outcomes, we're working to produce good practice guidance and digital data governance models that integrate fair and care practices. These outcomes, together with the cross-cutting relationships, will work towards longer-term goals of improving the overall quantity and quality of reusable cultural heritage data, reducing risks of harm, and encouraging meaningful participation in decision-making toward collective benefits for Indigenous nations, and ultimately with other descendant communities. Next slide, please. The network is divided into 3 working groups who, while focused on one of these particular research questions shown here, are each doing work that informs the other 2 groups. The first is to gain a better understanding of awareness of fair and care practices across sectors. Then explore how we can support and promote fair and care practices in institutional settings and among individuals that manage cultural heritage information. Another theme is how can data management practices better align interests across different sectors of cultural heritage? Specifically, how can FAIR be adapted to incorporate care needs, such as representing Indigenous concepts and worldviews, such as expressed in Indigenous languages, ontologies, and controlled vocabularies, so they meet Indigenous educational, cultural, or other goals? And finally, what supports are needed, such as guidelines, protocols, training, capacity building, and metadata, to make the benefits of FAIR data more equitably distributed while minimizing risks of harmful appropriation. Next slide, please. In order to investigate these questions, the working groups have developed a survey, which Chris will discuss in a moment, and convened follow-up focus groups. Next slide. We're working on gathering examples of implementation strategies for different types of cultural heritage organizations and communities. Although there is no single approach to implementing FAIR and CARE, we feel that specific examples of how entities are being more thoughtful and intentional about their practices will help support changes in practice over time. Next slide. And we're also committing time to community building across the various sectors of experts and institutions working with cultural heritage data. Our network participants have benefited from cross-sector collaboration on the working group research themes. In addition, an ongoing series of internal webinars by the network members are providing professional development opportunities for the entire group. These regular interactions are already supporting cross-sector conversations and understandings, and we hope that this relationship building will continue into the future as the network grows. On to Chris.
So what have we learned so far as part of this network? We did launch a survey, and the goal was really how can the archaeological community get data curated and accessible in an ethical manner? That was sort of the basis of the survey and the questions that we were asking. So in 2023, we developed and sent out a survey to federal, state, and local agencies, academics, CRMs, museums, and tribal communities. We tried to think of who out there might benefit from this. We really wanted to try to gain an idea of the awareness of the FAIR and CARE principles within the discipline. We wanted to try to identify some knowledge gaps, and we wanted to ultimately use these results to inform data governance documents or other assessment tools that the other working groups in the network will be working on. So ultimately, it was a fairly large survey. We had 48 questions plus 10 demographic questions, and we sent it out to thousands of people. We had about 766 respond, which we thought was absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, only about 378 of those answered the survey to about the 80% completion point. We had a FAIR and CARE section within the survey, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to compare responses within that across sectors. And so that's why we really focused on that, about 378 responses. So what did we learn just in terms of demographics? Who took our survey? 81% identified as white, 3% American Indian, and most were from either the Academy or CRM. So this sort of shows you the breakdown of the folks. And as you can see, folks across all different sectors did answer the survey. So we were fairly pleased about the responses. In terms of the questions we asked in the FAIR section, we asked things like, well, where do you store your final digital files? Do you create or use metadata? And what would help you most implement data access and reuse within your own organization or your own research? On the CARE side, we asked things like, how do you define Indigenous data? Do you engage with Indigenous peoples or descendant communities? And what types of data sensitivities are you aware of? And we're still working on going through this. This was a tremendous amount of information, but I just wanted to give you sort of a snippet of what we found. In general, many archaeologists only are using their personal or work computer to store final data files. 53% of respondents claim that their data are findable by others. 52% claim that supplemental data or resources associated with their publications or reports are publicly shared. And 62% claim that they or their organization do create metadata, but only 67% say that it is not publicly searchable. On the CARE side, we found that the CARE term is still largely unfamiliar, and we actually saw a dramatic drop-off in the number of responses in that transition from the FAIR to the CARE section. The respondents, it looks like most archaeologists still are not engaging with Indigenous peoples or descendant communities during their grant writing process, the development of data management plans, or while developing data use policies. The majority of respondents have not developed processes about data access or sharing with Indigenous peoples or descendant communities. And Indigenous peoples and descendant communities are really typically involved in the latter part of the project lifecycle. So initially what we're looking at is we see that there is a need for guidance, there's a need for funding, and there's a need for training in terms of these principles and implementing within our discipline. One of the last questions we actually asked was, well, now you've taken this survey, would you be interested in implementing the FAIR CARE principles within your organization or within your own research? And it was interesting because within FAIR practices, we had 170 say yes. And then 28 just said flat out no, which is, always kind of curious why that might be. But then 149 said maybe. And to me and to this group, we sort of indicates that there's still a lack of understanding of what those FAIR principles mean. And it's the same with the CARE principles. 156 said yes, we would like to implement these. 34 said no. And then 158, very similar patterns, said maybe. I think, again, demonstrating maybe that lack of information about that. So in terms of our sort of next steps with the survey and identifying gaps within this, we decided we were going to create some focus groups to try to tease out a little bit more information. We've already had one focus group with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. We've had another with the Society of Black Archaeologists, and we're hoping to set up 2 more, or potentially more, one with federal agency archaeologists and one with Latin American archaeologists.
So where do we go from here? Now, just as what Chris was saying in terms of the results of the survey and what we sort of already knew is that there are huge gaps in the knowledge about the FAIR and CARE principles. Also, with our work with our colleagues within the network, we know of other people within our larger network that there are projects out there that are practicing FAIR and CARE principles, but are not calling them as such because they're not aware that there are principles called FAIR and CARE. And so we wanted to make sure that we captured the way that those projects were working specifically with Indigenous people and their data so that we can then feed that information into understanding what's already being practiced out there. As a result, we are setting up interviews with project directors of these projects in order to better understand their data management plans, if they have them, what are the types of conversations they're having with the Indigenous people that they're working with, and of course, how the Indigenous communities are gaining access to that data and ultimately what becomes of that data. Neha?
Well, we're also working on a tool to help tribes, researchers, and CRM professionals in developing sort of a research agreement, something that's going to help them think about this data life cycle so that they've got an idea of what sort of information is needed from the get-go to help them design those projects in a way that the community is actually involved. Part of this is going to, of course, it's going to be available online, but we're also creating a number of educational guides and materials. And like Desiree said, understanding those examples to implement how people have actually implemented FAIR and CARE principles in their practice. So we want to be able to show that these are some of the examples out there. By doing public talks to encourage a broad understanding and adoption of these principles and practices. And of course, we are also going to be continuing with traditional publications and conferences. That's right.
So one of the major things that we learned that we didn't know we were going to learn was the result of the dismantling of the IMLS agency, and meaning that our funds for the grant was suspended in March. And although we were making great progress, having great conversations, and collaborating with our colleagues, and we knew that we wanted to continue that even if we didn't have funding, we then realized that it shouldn't just be one group of people working on this, but also making sure that we outreach to the professional organizations that we are members of in order to get them involved in being able to then hopefully go out and lobby on the federal level or state level in order to get government support of what we're trying to do. I was a former Society of American Archaeology board member, and I just rotated off this spring, but prior to leaving the board, I requested that a task force be created within the Society of American Archaeology to help explore how archaeologists and the society can support the application of the FAIR and CARE principles in all of the work that SAA members do. So although it was drastic that the funds were taken away from us, and of course they have been reinstated and we're going to be continuing our work, it is very important and brought to light that in order to really make a change in the discipline, in order to make sure that everybody understands what we're trying to do and how, I won't say easy, but once we start to create a process, that it'll be almost second nature to ensure that we are mindful of what happens to the data that we create and that we ensure that Indigenous people are along for the whole process of any project. Neha?
Get involved, provide your feedback, ask questions, engage in ongoing conversations with us in the network, because it's really your collective input and expertise that will help us to develop these shared data management practices and guidance. Look for us, look for the network in the September issue of the SAA Archaeological Record. And of course, join our community, join our growing community in practicing and advancing FAIR and CARE principles in the sector. We've got a QR code on our slide. Use it. Please learn more. Contact us. Thank you.
Well, okay, so I was supposed to be your host to start off the webinar, and I didn't get a chance to introduce myself to all of you. I've met Sarah before, and Desiree, I think we met before too, but I'm John, John Dombrowski. It is nice to see you all, and thank you so much for the presentation.
You.
It's fantastic. So I can get us started. I've got tons of questions. We've got questions that are starting to roll in right now. I'm going to start off with a selfish John question. So when we think about kind of training in archaeology and the academy, what kind of things do you all think about of where to implement fair and care standards, where we need to go? From my kind of perspective, maybe it's a little myopic. One of the things that I think about is kind of archaeologists, and maybe I'm painting with too broad of a brush. We don't really care much about data sometimes. I think we're trained to value stories a lot, and the data comes second. So, like this idea of a data like life cycle is probably really foreign to people. So, how do we break this trend? How do we change values with training?
Well, I think one way is looking at it as something that maybe not everybody has to learn how to teach, but maybe they need to learn how to find resources like the kinds of things we're hoping to develop, and
Right.
then use them to incorporate them into their lessons. And so, like with data, yeah, I agree with you. People aren't really thinking about data that much, and not everybody teaches it. And data management is something that I care a lot about. And it feels like you can't expect everyone to be able to teach that, and so it's really great to be able to have external resources to go to be able to deal with that subject matter across the board, and incorporate it into your lessons rather than having to learn it yourself. So that's, again, with the sort of guidelines and trainings that we're trying to develop with this project. We're hoping that these kinds of things can be sort of not necessarily plug and play, but at least something that could be adaptable to people's teaching, that they can incorporate it into their lesson plans without having to become experts on fair and care.
Right.
I would take it down to reconnecting the data to the people. And I just realized I totally didn't explain the photo that was of the picture of one of my tribal leaders at a burial site that was being excavated, in that, we have to realize that the data is not data, right? It's the same thing of when we're trying to teach about the connection of old artifacts, that there's still a connection, and indigenous people don't look at old artifacts as artifacts, but as relatives, as something that needs to be protected to honor their ancestors. Data is similar, even though it's digital, and in some instances it is, on paper, but it holds the same weight because it holds that knowledge from the ancestors. And understanding that data has been misused in order to subjugate indigenous people. So I think if we bring it down back and not think about it as this other inanimate object entity, but understand the implications that data has for living people. And if you start from there, then it becomes really necessary that we have to talk about data governance. We have to talk about data sovereignty, because ultimately the ancestors that were excavated in Los Angeles, that picture was showing that my tribal leader was at, they were 3D scanned, even though the ancestors were reburied, and the tribe does not have access to that 3D scan. It's currently being curated by a museum, but any scholar could go there, get that data, and create a clone, a plastic clone, a 3D printed clone of my ancestor, and so those types of things weren't thought of. Of course, this happened in the early 2000s, so we weren't even thinking about that back then in terms of sovereignty and access, but you have to connect it to the people, and that's what's missing in archaeology. And I talk a lot about that when I talk about practicing indigenous archaeology, you have to remember the people first when you're talking about anything as it relates to the information that you're gathering about the ancient people you're working with.
I think it's such a good point, Desiree, is like at least some of the responses that I get when I think about getting really like we talk about data, or if someone was, I guess they were saying, oh, John's being nerdy about data. They're getting really passionate about this kind of concept. It's like, oh, this is just not very important to archaeology, the data, but data itself is extracted from people, right? So I think we forget that, and I really appreciate your comment saying that that's one way to change values. Does anyone else want to comment on that question before we move on to another one?
I would just say, within the academy, there's been a focus on, are you a lithic analyst? Are you a faunal analyst, ceramics, whatever else it is? And we teach skills related to those items, but we often don't teach skills about data or the things that Desiree was talking about. That's lacking. And there is space within the current structure of a lot of these classes to include this, type of conversation. If you're going to talk about collecting data or information, you should talk about how you're going to treat it. Treat it with respect and everything else, and what's the data life cycle that's part of it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a standalone thing. It can be incorporated with whatever we have going on. That being said, I think we would like to see more courses and whatnot about that, about curation of data or data management. Because again, this happens across the sciences and the humanities. Information and data are being collected, but ultimately that digital curation crisis is being seen across all sorts of disciplines. So how can we sort of stem that tide?
Right. Maybe again, I'm just being snooty here and very opinionated, but I'm owning it. But I I'll talk to a lot of, say, grad students, and just organizing data. What a database is very foreign concept, right?
Mhm.
I don't think we do a good job, and I'm painting with a broad brush again, and I realize that, do a good job of teaching that. So in relation to that kind of, I guess, vision, that there is a life cycle beyond is far advanced beyond just that, and it's a shame. I think you all are doing an amazing thing here. Um, so let's see. We have some more questions kind of coming in from the audience. One of these first ones is just, with all the changing federal and state um, things that are going on right now, how has it been to work with state and local historical societies or parks or things like that? Is there any comments that you can give on that? I realize this is a sensitive question.
Challenging.
Yeah.
There's been, and I won't name names, but we've had some participants that were part of our network that have said that they cannot continue to participate within their official capacity, even though they are definitely interested in it. So yeah, I think there's a challenge there. I think, when we heard about the IMLS being pulled, um, I think at least the directors, I don't want to speak for everybody, but we were like, well, we want to continue on with this work regardless, right? It's like we understand that there's all sorts of crazy stuff happening in DC with funding and everything else, but we are dedicated to this. And I think a lot of the network participants are too, which was really nice to see.
Anyone else on that question, or would you like to move on?
Well, just to add to that, what Chris said, the network, that when the grant was terminated, yeah, in that month before we got the money back, people were just like, yeah, I want to stay doing this. And it was so encouraging because it almost like liberated us to start thinking outside the box, basically, of what we had planned. And we're like, we can just spread, anyone can join the network now. Like, when you can all, so it kind of made us think beyond, the confines of this plan that we had. And I think that actually helped us a lot, thinking about, like Desiree talked about, we basically fast tracked that plan to sort of how can we get this adopted at professional societies and get this supported beyond the term of the grant, because the term of the grant was all of a sudden there. And again, now we're sort of back to plan A, which, but I think that having a plan B inspired us to come up with some new ideas.
got a pretty great question here if we're ready to move on. This one is, when we have legacy data that were collected decades ago and can't begin the full life cycle of FAIR and CARE together, how do we go about retrofitting these principles to past projects if we want to carry them forward?
I'll take that one because I'm thinking about we recently had an elder pass, and she was working not necessarily with archaeologists but other scholars at a particular college, which will shall remain nameless.
Mhm.
And she did interviews, students interviewed her, wrote papers, they did videos of her, giving a lot of information, not only about herself and her history, but information about the tribe, about our sacred spaces and places, a lot of information about plants and everything. She was an open book to those scholars. And when she passed, they never gave her copies of her own videos or audio or copies of the papers that the students had. And so as her relatives were like, where's all this information? You as an institution should have been doing some curating this in some instance. And now that she's passed, we're grateful that this was recorded, but we want to use it. We want to, whatever we didn't know and she shared, we want to pass that on to the next generation within our community. And so that's the first thing, is finding it, right? Where is it? And what is it? And then particularly as it relates to Indigenous people, who could it be culturally affiliated to? Who would have, would want to have access to it? And then who has access to it now, and start those conversations with the community. One of the projects that I'm working with at UCLA is to create a digital archive for the Gabrielino Tongva tribe in order to place all of that data, not only videos that she's done, that she participated in, and the information that was written about the data that she gave, but also my own videos that I've done of individuals from our community. And of course, as an archaeologist, the data that I've collected based on the sites work that I did out on Catalina. That can happen. It takes a lot of time. No one in my community has that expertise except for but I'm going to be teaching my community. So, that's where you start. Once you find it, then you start reaching out to the community like, hey, here is this information. Here's what we know what's in it, or here's what we don't know what's in it. Let's work together to figure out the most appropriate way to deal with this data.
Right. Uh, Your response, Desiree, just makes me think of, like, do I know of a museum institution? I could be totally off base here, but at least museums that I've worked with, has it been readily apparent to me that there is some mechanism to systematically collect data that is derived from collections? And I don't think there is, at least for the ones that I've been, worked with. That's just, the amount of work, but how important that would be.
I know when I was working at the Harvard Peabody Museum, when would have researchers come in to research the files, we asked them to, whatever final publication they created, to send it back to the museum, including whatever kind of data set that they have. Whether that got followed through with or
Right.
checked, or, a pitchfork went after them or something. I don't know what the compliance portion of it was, but at
Right.
least that was out there in a request.
Right.
That's something I wanted to add to. Oh, sorry.
No, yeah, go
Just
ahead.
to add to that, legacy data, all that Desiree was talking about, all these conversations and the relationships and the time that people put into exploring and investigating legacy data, a lot of that, whatever they end up doing with it or improving it or making it better documented, a lot of that relationship building doesn't get documented. And I think that's another issue that we have here talking about FAIR and CARE, is that there's one thing about the data itself, and then there's something about the documenting all of that the people involved and the relationships involved, and how do you build that into the data set so that people reusing it in the future will know about this work that was done, because it's never going to be perfect, right? And so you're going to have to, it's better to know that history. The The other thing I just wanted to point out is that also legacy, like I could create legacy data today if I'm not documenting it well. So, right, we're not just talking about data from like 40 years ago. We're talking about like what you're doing right now if you're not doing a good job of describing your data and making it available or whatever, following FAIR and CARE, you are creating legacy data that maybe even you won't be able to use in the future because it's not, well described and documented. So,
And I would the last thing I would add there is that also there's digital curators out there. If you have questions about a process or metadata, whether it's your home institution repository, the Library of Congress, NARA, anything out there, right? Reach out if you have questions. And there's folks out there that would like to help.
Anyone else on this? Any other ideas?
I'll just add that there are lots of good examples of museums actually recognizing that they need to reconnect their data, and not just the physical, but also these digital data that they have back to communities. So I can give you an example here from Canada. It's at the Museum of Anthropology. They worked with the Amista Cultural Society. They worked with the Stolo, the Mestruim, to create the Reciprocal Research Network, so rrncommunity.org. And this is basically, this was launched in 2014. So this was actually before CARE, this was before FAIR, and it was launched essentially because of the need for communities to be able to actually learn which museums have what. So in the Pacific Northwest, so much of the materials were taken. There's no record of what was taken and where it currently resides. And so the idea of the RRN was actually to provide this one central place where different museums would share their own catalogs, and that communities could go in and actually say, oh, actually, this is something that's from our nation, and that you've misnamed this, or we would actually like to be in conversation about how we can be reconnected, whether that ends up into a repatriation process or something else. It should be the very starting point of actually learning where all of that heritage is held. So there are different examples that have, that's exactly what Desiree was talking about, that, there are lots of people who have been doing this, sometimes well before FAIR and CARE, but very much following the same sorts of principles that we have now.
Right. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. It's really important. There's one question that kind of touches on something that Christopher said here. And this person said, is there a line of work where archaeologists are working with both archaeological and contemporary data in partnership with Indigenous communities? And you kind of said, Christopher, like there's digital data curators and reach out to these people. Can you elaborate a little bit more, as this is a line of work?
Yeah, I think that this is happening a lot. I mean, I know within Desiree's community, working outreach with, being active with the community and on a lot of these archaeological endeavors, it's happening a lot.
I mean, I think the increase in the number of programs on data science that are at universities, people are majoring in data science. There are a lot of people in libraries, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for working with librarians and people who work with digital libraries and archivists there who, I don't think archaeologists or academics or whoever talk that much with people in libraries. And I think there's a lot more opportunity there to do work together and to see what they have to offer, because they work with this kind of stuff all the time, metadata and ontologies and what to do with people's content. And that's one place where people could reach out more, see what's going on at your university.
So this actually goes back to your earlier question about teaching at the undergraduate or at the graduate level. This is part of our issue, that so much of what we do is kind of like you just go into streams. It's fragmented. It's compartmentalized. And one of the things that Indigenous data sovereignty does is that it actually forces you to collapse that, precisely because it's about Indigenous peoples, it's about their knowledge that doesn't neatly fit into any one of those boxes. And again, bringing a lot of that thinking into the undergraduate curriculum, I think that's that's on folks who are in universities, who are in those positions, like myself,
Yeah.
to actually bring that to the classroom. And it shouldn't be something that you have to wait to grad school to do,
Right.
right? Like
Yeah.
this is supposed to be part of, this is how we can do this, and it's part of learning how to do it right the first time.
Right.
And regardless of where you are in the data life cycle, like museums, like I said, are also, museum folks have been doing this work. Libraries are also doing this work. So it's about us being able to talk with them early on, and to introduce our students to those specialists as well.
Right. This person, and I think you just addressed this, this person also brought up, expanded on this a little bit, talking about actually working maybe a little more with cultural anthropologists too in this. And like you say, not getting, tunneled into one kind of track here. I think that's really important. One thing that I was curious about, and we'll make this the last question. I want to be respectful of all of your time. But one of the things, do we have any examples of that you all know of where FAIR and CARE has been thought of from the start? Archaeological projects or things like that. Maybe that's something that I missed in the beginning. I had a bumpy start, so I'm sorry if that happened.
I'm trying to do that with mine.
Yeah.
Well, part of it,
So-
these are, I mean, the care term is relatively new too. I mean,
Right.
I think some of the elements of care and fair have been done for a long time, and there's archaeologists who have done this. But I think explicitly this is something that's new. But like Neha says, I think this is trying to incorporate more.
Yeah, and one of the things like I said, one of the things that we're doing is collecting those projects that may be using Fair and Care, but not naming it. My own project that I started out, the Pimu Catalina Island Archaeology Project, from the very beginning was actually started with care, but also was started because my community didn't have access to the archaeological sites or even knowledge of where the archaeological sites were on Catalina. And so once we started to create that project, and then we started to talk to local people who were not indigenous but lived on the island for like 5 generations. They also they had a connection to the land. And so one of the things that we've tried to do with our work is not only give public lectures, but we were building a site that provided the archaeological information we gathered from our excavations at the historic hunting lodge that we did during the project, so that it could be available for the school children to then go in and do their own interpretations and play around with the data and things like that. So again, there are projects out there that do it but don't name it using these specific terms. And so hopefully, once we create our tool and show how easy it is to do, everybody will jump on board and really, apply those to whatever project that they're currently doing retroactively, and then whatever new project that they might be thinking about.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what we're thinking, is that having many examples will be really
Yeah.
helpful, so people can see, oh, that's how they did it. I can use this or that from their example and adapt it to mine, because while FAIR is more technical and it's like, okay, I've got metadata, I've got identifiers, yeah, check. CARE is like case by case specific, right? And you're not going to have a one size fits all CARE answer. And so it's a matter of looking at these examples and being inspired by what other people are doing, and then coming up with your own approach.
Sarah, you read my mind. I was just thinking very selfishly. I was just thinking like, man, it'd be great to have like just like a book of case studies that like, retroactively we think
Yeah.
about these principles, things that met these kinds of benchmarks. So that's really interesting. Anything else on that topic? I don't want to cut things short.
Now, thinking back across Crow Canyon's history of research and working to incorporate indigenous voices. I mean, I think it's without explicitly saying that that's care, that long-term relationship building with communities in the Four Corners area is sort of that's grounded in that.
Right. Anything else? Okay, well, we've got people in the chat just talking about how interesting this talk was and just thanking you for your time. Thank you so much for taking the time and giving this fantastic presentation. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
the
so much for
invitation.
having us.
Yeah, thank you for all the work that you do.
And thank you.
And for our audience, before we cut this out, Laura's going to click the button. There is no webinar next week. We have webinars the following weeks. So see us then. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.